Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at expansionary fiscal policy, which is how the government responds to a recession. So the government is going to expand its influence in the economy in order to stimulate aggregate demand because the country has fallen into a recession. That's the big picture of expansionary fiscal policy. The government responds to increase aggregate demand during a recession. So this is demand side policy to increase aggregate demand. So the idea is if an economy has experienced a fall in aggregate demand, it could be in a demand deficient recession. Think about that, demand deficient recession. Aggregate demand is deficient and therefore we're in recession. Okay. So the response, to respond, a government can use expansionary fiscal policy, which is to increase spending and or decrease taxes on people, and that will result in more discretionary income if you decrease taxes for consumers, and people will spend their extra money in expanding aggregate demand or increase government spending. Okay, there's the two sides of that hammer of fiscal policy. So what would this look like on a graph? Well, I've showed this before, and I forgot my ones here, but this is aggregate demand 1, this is aggregate demand 2. And so we're imagining a world where we are operating at P2, Y2, where output is at Y2 and P2, and it's the result of a fall in aggregate demand. So this is demand deficient recession or a recessionary gap. So the government has an interest in getting the economy operating back up here, of course, at this optimal point. And so what's it going to do? Well, it needs to stimulate the economy to move aggregate demand outward. And it could do that by cutting taxes, and people have more money to spend, and aggregate demand will go out, and or combination of both usually, government spending, and that will move aggregate demand out, of course, because aggregate demand has components of consumption and government spending inside it. So the question then becomes, what happens overall on its impact on deficits and debt? So the government is expanding its fiscal policy, which means that it's cutting taxes, which means it's losing revenue, and or then spending more. So hold on a second. Expansionary fiscal policy is a combination of the government cutting its revenue, but spending more. That's the equivalent of a person who has a job, right? And in order to stimulate the growth of their household, they are going to work less, cut revenues, cut income, but then spend more? Well, that sounds like a really bad idea. Well, it is a really bad idea if you're thinking about straight up household economics. But remember, the government is the parent of the economy, and they are the ones who are most capable of solving this problem. So it would kind of be like a government, like a parent trying to help out a kid in order to overall improve the well-being of the society. And so what the government's going to do is it's going to tax cut. It's going to create the impact on deficits. A tax cut is a part of an expansionary fiscal policy, which should create an indirect injection into the economy. This would increase household disposable income to hopefully increase consumption, but it would also lead to an increase in savings and imports, and would result in less of an effect on the direct government spending. Whoa, what does that mean? Okay, it's pretty straightforward. The government wants to get aggregate demand out, so they cut taxes to stimulate consumption. But the thing is, if you get a 10% tax break, and let's say you make a ton of money, like $100,000 a year, and instead of paying 30% tax, you're only paying 30% tax, you're only paying 20% tax. That means that you're taking home at the end of the year $80,000 after the tax break instead of $70,000. So you have $10,000 more in your pocket at the end of the year, and the government did that because they want you to spend it to increase aggregate demand, but you decide to save half of it. Well, what's savings? That's a leakage. Oof. And then you decide to go I don't know, buy you live in Canada, and you want to buy some really beautiful French lamps for your house, and so you import lamps for your Canadian household. Where did that money go? It left Canada and it went to France, so that is a leakage too. And that actually would mean that even though the government gave you $10,000 more to spend, you're not really going to spend it all. You're going to save some of it, hopefully, or you're going to import more things. So therefore, a tax cut, in terms of its impact on aggregate demand, would result in less of an effect than government spending. All right. The other aspect of it is a fiscal stimulus, which is a fancy way of saying this is government way of stimulating the economy, which means they could cut the tax rate and increase government spending. And this, of course, would lead to a budget deficit because they've increased spending while they've given you a tax break. And so spending while cutting taxes would increase the national deficit. I think you get that. So because the tax cut isn't the best way of stimulating demand, because there's going to be some savings and some leakage as a result of people buying imported French lamps, the government would cut taxes and increase its spending, because increased spending of a government actually leads to a direct expansion of aggregate demand. But it's going to lead to a deficit because you're cutting taxes, less income, and increasing spending. That's a problem. Okay? I think that's pretty straightforward. The question then becomes, what's the impact of all of this? And I broke this down even more. Right? And an increase in government expenditure is a bit repetitive, so I'm going to go through this fast. If the government's spending more, it would increase employment opportunities, for sure. When the United States went into its financial crisis in 2008, 2009, Barack Obama did an executive order that released $3 billion to fix U.S. highways. What does that mean? There was all of a sudden money available for private firms to hire more construction workers because the government was going to sponsor these construction jobs to help build U.S. or fix the U.S. highway system. That makes sense. That would therefore have an immediate increase in aggregate demand. There'd be an increase in government spending will lead to an increase in household and firm spending, because all of a sudden now, if you are a construction worker and you're out of work and Obama released $3 billion and now you have a job, and so now you have an income, that's going to mean that you're going to spend more. That also means the firms are going to spend more because now all of a sudden they have a project and they're going to all of a sudden buy a new tractor they need in order to destroy the road that they're going to rebuild. So that has a direct impact on aggregate demand that's private, right? Because it's consumption. But an increased expenditure would also have that impact. And the impact of government spending is multiplied, therefore. So when Obama released the $3 billion, it created new employment, and that employment led to more people buying stuff at Walmart, which made Walmart more profitable, which led to more stimulus in the economy. And likewise, when Obama released the $3 billion, that got multiplied, that government spending got multiplied because the private firms who are construction firms are buying new tractors from Caterpillar. Right now, Caterpillar is hiring more people because you get it. It gets multiplied. Okay. But, so that is government spending. And so you can see how that will have a pretty big impact on aggregate demand. And the government could feel all proud of itself by watching that aggregate demand curve go out immediately through government expenditures and its impact on household and firm spending. A tax cut, however, will increase disposable income, but as I said, will lead to an increased savings rate, maybe a leakage, and also increased imports, because the more money people have, the more likely they are even to go on a foreign holiday or something, right? Okay. Cool, I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, how would you illustrate this? Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? I already showed you this. I've showed you this graph now. This is the third time I've showed you this graph in videos, twice in the same video. So it's pretty straightforward. You got to be able to label this, though, right? But you're going to start off with a situation where aggregate demand is here as AD1, and the goal is to get it back out to a full level of output, full level of unemployment, or natural rate of unemployment, back to where it was before the demand-deficient recession. So what's the impact on GDP? Well, GDP is going to go from Y2 to Y. Dude, that's an increase in real output, which is an increase in GDP. What about unemployment? Well, unemployment, remember, this is a lot, 5% unemployment. Anytime you're operating on the inside of this, you have increased unemployment. So this is probably, say, 8%, 10% unemployment. If aggregate demand goes back out to here from AD1 to AD2, it's going to have a positive impact on unemployment, meaning that you're going to go back to a full and natural rate of unemployment, somewhere around 5%. So unemployment goes down, right, as output goes up. That makes sense too. What about inflation? Well, we're talking about price levels over here. If the government is all of a sudden start spending a bunch of stuff and there's a multiplier effect of other people spending as a result of having a new job and firms spending as a result of having new money to buy tractors, you can see that overall price levels will actually go up. So expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase GDP, decrease unemployment, but put inflationary pressure into the system. And this is all in response to a recessionary gap as a result of demand-deficient recession. All right? So that all kind of rolls together pretty nicely for you. I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, what about on full employment? Expansionary fiscal policy at full employment level. Well, at full employment level, what does that mean? That means that the society is actually already working here. So expansionary fiscal policy, if you were to do that when unemployment's at 5%, you don't have any demand deficient unemployment, and it's a demand deficient recession, there is no recession, everything's humming along, and then all of a sudden the government starts cutting taxes and increasing spending, well, what's going to happen? Well, naturally, aggregate demand is going to expand, right, from 81 out to 82. And then what? Well, there's only a slight increase you can see here in output because you're going beyond the full capacity. Of course, unemployment is down, right, because this is 5%. This is going to be like 3%. But we know from our studies of unemployment, this is only temporary. Eventually, either aggregate demand is going to fall back or the short-run aggregate supply is going to shift inward, and we're going to go back to where we always go in the long run, which is the long-run aggregate supply curve. But the thing is, if there's expansionary fiscal policy at the full employment level, the government is actually creating price level increase, which is to say contributing only to inflation. And that is not a good thing. Okay, so at full level of employment, which is about 5%, if the government does expansionary fiscal policy, it will increase output naturally, but increase inflation levels or create inflationary pressure in the economy. All right, I think that's pretty straightforward. I hope that you're seeing, once you get your brain into fiscal policy, it's not really that complex. It sounds complex. You gotta kind of get your whole mind calibrated correctly. But once you get into it, it's pretty straightforward. It's just aggregate supply, aggregate demand, simple stuff. Okay? Coolio, my friends. I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.